The moment he leaned across the defense table and hissed, "You don't have authority over a free man," people thought they were watching another loud courtroom stunt. Then he jabbed a finger straight at Judge Caprio, turned toward the back doors and barked, "Go get him, boys!" And the air in the room changed so fast it felt like the oxygen had been ripped out. A bailiff's hand dropped to his radio. A woman in the gallery gasped so sharply it sounded like glass cracking. The courtroom went silent, not the ordinary kind of quiet, but the kind that arrives when everyone realizes they may be standing inside the exact second a bully finally picks the wrong room, the wrong victim, and the wrong judge. Judge Caprio did not flinch. He didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice. Under the pale courtroom lights, with his black robe falling perfectly still around his shoulders and his reading glasses low on the bridge of his nose, he looked less like a man surprised and more like a man who had just seen a lie take its final breath. Across from him, the defendant stood in a tailored charcoal suit so expensive it practically shone, gold cufflinks at his wrists, a heavy watch flashing every time he pointed, his posture loose with entitlement, his smile half sneer, half dare. He had walked in that morning believing this would be easy. He thought this was a little municipal circus. He thought the old woman he'd tormented would be too poor, too tired, too frightened to matter. He thought the pseudo-legal phrases he'd memorized online would shield him from consequence. He thought wrong. And if you've ever seen arrogance confuse patience for weakness, stay with this story, because what happened next is exactly why people still believe justice can arrive like thunder. At first glance, it had looked like a petty dispute, a parking lot collision, a denied insurance exchange, a shouting match outside a discount pharmacy on a rain-slick Tuesday afternoon. The complainant, Rosa Delgado, sat in the front row with both hands folded over a worn leather purse she held like an anchor. She was 63, a widow, a school cafeteria worker with tired eyes and a neat cream cardigan buttoned all the way to the top, despite the heat in the room. The defendant had slammed his luxury SUV into her aging sedan, stepped out, laughed at the dent he'd caused, and refused to provide registration or insurance. When she tried to take a photograph of his plate, he'd slapped the phone from her hand and told her, in front of strangers, "People like you should be grateful I even stopped." She had still come to court. Not loud, not vengeful, just dignified, frightened, and determined. That alone made half the room want to protect her. The defendant called himself a sovereign citizen, though what he really seemed to be was a wealthy coward wrapped in internet jargon. He insisted he was traveling, not driving. He declared the license requirement unlawful, the court a corporation, the state a fiction, and every clerk who processed his paperwork a participant in fraud. He smirked while he said it, rocking slightly on his heels as if he were enjoying a private joke. When Rosa testified, he rolled his eyes and whispered loudly enough for the microphones to catch it. "This is why poor people weaponize tears." A low murmur ran through the gallery. Rosa's chin trembled once, just once, and then she lifted it again. Judge Caprio watched all of it with the kind of stillness that makes liars nervous before they know why. Then he asked for the pharmacy CCTV. That's when everything changed. The screen flickered to life and the room saw what Rosa had lived through. There was her little gray sedan, parked crooked but harmless. There was his black SUV slicing in too fast, clipping her rear quarter panel, jerking her car sideways. There he was stepping out in polished shoes, not apologetic, not startled, not even inconvenienced. He walked up to Rosa while she stood in the rain with one hand over her mouth, and the footage showed him knocking the phone clean out of her hand. Then, with a smile visible even through the grainy video, he leaned close and said something the parking lot camera could not hear. Rosa had told the court, he said, "I can make people disappear in paperwork." The defendant snorted when that line was repeated. Then the clerk produced the audio from a nearby delivery van dash cam. Suddenly his own voice filled the courtroom, cold and gleeful and unmistakable. "I can make people disappear in paperwork. Try me." A woman near the back muttered, "Oh my God." The courtroom went silent again. His face changed for the first time. Not much, just enough. The smugness around the mouth tightened. The shoulders drew back too stiffly. He recovered fast and tried to sneer his way through it. He said the footage had been edited. He said the witness was incompetent. He said Rosa was manipulating sympathy because she knew she was beneath him and needed leverage. Then he delivered the line that poisoned the room beyond repair. Looking straight at Judge Caprio, he laughed and said, "With respect, you're just an old man in a rented robe reading from a script." The gasp that followed moved like a wave through the benches. Even the stenographer stopped for half a heartbeat. Judge Caprio removed his glasses, folded them once, and set them down with exquisite care. "A raised chin," he said, his voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in, "does not elevate a small man." It landed like a hammer. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Wow." The defendant's grin flickered. Then the prosecutor asked to introduce supplemental evidence connected to Rosa's complaint, and suddenly this wasn't about a parking lot anymore. Certified records showed the defendant had filed fraudulent liens against 2 court employees in prior disputes. Messages recovered from his phone showed him bragging in a group chat about burying peasants in paper until they fold. One text, sent the night before the hearing, read, "Caprio thinks he's untouchable. Let him try that old man act when my people show up." A courthouse security officer testified that several men associated with the defendant had been seen lingering outside that morning, filming entrances, asking about judge parking, and laughing when told to leave. Another witness, a trembling 19-year-old court intern named Eli Mercer, described how the defendant had cornered him in a hallway weeks earlier, shoved a stack of documents into his chest, and warned him that clerks and interns bleed the same as judges. Eli's voice cracked on the word judges, but he kept going. He was young, badly frightened, and clearly telling the truth. The contrast in the room was unbearable now. A rich man treating the law like theater, and ordinary people carrying the cost of his games in their bodies. The defendant could feel the floor giving way under him, and arrogance always gets loud before it collapses. He started talking over everyone. He pounded the table. He accused the prosecutor of conspiracy, the witnesses of perjury, the court of tyranny. Sweat began to gather at his temples, turning his confidence shiny and desperate. Judge Caprio warned him once, then twice. He ignored both warnings and jabbed a finger toward Rosa, calling her trash coached by parasites. Rosa did not cry. She looked at him with a steadiness that felt almost holy. That was when he pivoted toward the bench, face flushed, lips curling with reckless contempt, and spat, "You think this room protects you?" Then he twisted toward the back and shouted, "Go get him, boys!" Every head snapped toward the doors. A bailiff moved. Another officer stepped between the gallery and the bench. For one electric second, nobody knew whether men were about to rush in, whether this had all been theater, whether the threat was bluff or signal. The courtroom went dead silent. Judge Caprio remained seated. He looked directly at the defendant, and in that unbearable stillness, the old judge's calm became more frightening than any scream. "No," he said, each word sharp and clean. "This room protects the people from men like you." The line struck so hard it seemed to empty the defendant of air. Outside, security detained 2 men with cameras and tactical vests they claimed were documentarians. Inside, the defendant's bravado finally cracked. His eyes darted, his hands shook, the swagger was gone. For the first time all day, he looked like what he was. Not a warrior, not a rebel, not a free man, just a frightened bully who had mistaken intimidation for strength for far too long. And then came the monologue people would replay 1,000 times. Judge Caprio leaned forward, hands clasped, voice low, controlled, devastating. He said the law was not an inconvenience to be shouted down by wealth, nor a costume to be mocked by men who had never felt real hardship. He said sovereign citizen rhetoric had become a hiding place for cowards who wanted the benefits of civilization without any of the duties that make civilization possible. He said Rosa Delgado had gone to work every day, paid what she owed, buried a husband, raised children, and still walked into court with more dignity than the defendant had shown in his entire performance. He said Eli Mercer, a frightened intern with no power at all, had displayed more courage telling the truth than the defendant had shown in all his posturing. Then he fixed the defendant with a look so steady it seemed to pin him in place and delivered the sentence that burned itself into the room. "You are not being punished for refusing to bow to authority. You are being punished because you confuse cruelty with freedom, and in this courtroom, cruelty is not a right." Not a soul moved. He found the defendant in contempt on the spot. He referred the threat against the court for criminal prosecution. He ordered immediate remand pending a dangerousness assessment. He authorized investigation into the fraudulent liens, the witness intimidation, and the coordinated presence outside the courthouse. He awarded full restitution to Rosa for property damage, emotional distress where permitted, and replacement of lost wages from the workdays she'd missed dealing with the harassment. But what made the ending feel like justice and not paperwork was the way Judge Caprio spoke directly to Rosa before the deputies led the defendant away. He told her, gently, that her voice had mattered, that courage did not require volume, and that decency had stood its ground that day. Rosa covered her mouth and finally cried, not from fear this time, but from relief so profound it seemed to bend her forward. Behind her, strangers in the gallery began to clap before catching themselves. Even then, the defendant tried one last glare over his shoulder, but it had no power left. The room had seen him too clearly. Later, the ripple effects kept coming. The criminal referral led to additional charges. The fake lien filings were unwound. The two men outside the courthouse turned on him when confronted with messages and call logs. Eli Mercer stayed in law, saying that one day in that courtroom taught him the difference between authority and integrity. Rosa got her car repaired, then quietly became the kind of local hero she never would have called herself. People in her neighborhood started bringing her groceries, offering rides, stopping her just to say they were proud she hadn't backed down, and Judge Caprio's one-liners traveled far beyond that courthouse because sometimes the internet does recognize the real thing when it sees it. Not rage, not spectacle, but disciplined moral force, meeting arrogance head-on and refusing to blink. So if you've ever watched a bully mistake kindness for weakness, let this be the reminder that patience is not surrender. Decency is not fragility, and the law, in the right hands, can still speak with a voice that makes cruelty tremble. If this story hit you in the chest, if you felt that moment when the courtroom went silent and everything changed, leave your thoughts in the comments, like this video, subscribe for more stories where justice doesn't whisper, and share this with someone who needs to remember that sooner or later, every arrogant man reaches the bench where the performance ends.